Hi, everybody. If you don't recognize me by my big headphones, my name is Miss Amber. I am one of the curriculum guides, specialists, tutors. And first of all, I want to say welcome back. This is a re-recording of a video on the Literature and American Revolution live lesson. Um, for anyone who doesn't know, we have videos on every single tutorial going over the slides. And this is just a new recording. We had to re-upload it. So, a couple of things before we start. This is going to be a very long recording. There is a long timeline. There's a lot of history in this lesson. So there's going to be a few different places where I sort of try to remind you to pause the video and take a break before we kind of like dive into other sections. The second reminder is that these videos only cover the tutorial slides and not the reading selection slides. If we were to put it all together, it would be a much longer video. So we're working on separate reading selection reviews for you guys. So you don't have to sit through it if you don't need it. You can only get the reading selection if you do need it. Okay. Since this is going to be a long video, I want to remind everyone what the point of English videos actually are, or what the English curriculum actually is. The point of these videos is actually to give you not just background on how things are written and how you can write those things, but also the history behind why something was written, because that affects how it's written. So if you've ever been the type of person to sort of wonder, um, why are these lessons here? Why is why is there so much background history? Why can't you just give me the reading selection? That's why. If we just tell you, oh, this was written like that, here's an example of XYZ, that doesn't actually teach you about how English started versus where it is now, right? That's kind of the point of English. I know that once you get into English 11, it all seems kind of overwhelming. We're going back to look at a lot of old language and it's kind of difficult and sometimes annoying, but that's why. So try to keep that in mind while you're going through the lesson. Alrighty, I've gone on enough. So now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we're just going to open up the lesson. So here we go, scrolling down. Now this is the 5th lesson in Unit 1. And we are going to get started on slide number 5. So I'm just going to click over here. Another reminder before we get started, we're skipping over question slides and things like that. I'm just going over the material that's on these slides. I'm kind of trying to give you summaries of what's here. Please go back and actually read these all the way through so that you can have what you need for your notes. I'm just trying to hit the important points to help make sure you understand the gist of what's being said. If you are following along on the slides while you have the lesson open, so like if you have this video and the tutorial open at the same time, I would read the slide first, then start playing the video so that you could get a summary of what you read and maybe make some connections maybe you didn't make. I feel like if you listen first and then read it, it's a little harder to make those connections. But all right, here we go. So we're starting on slide 5. It's called Significance of the Age of Reason. And that's exactly what it's about. Significance is why something is important. They are explaining why even studying this time period is important. But basically, the Age of Reason is the time that led all the way up to the US or the American colonies, as they were called during this time, took or declared its independence from Britain. So this is all the events that led up to that point. The way that people communicated with each other, sharing ideas and their thoughts, was through writing. So that's why we're studying this in the English class. At this time, writers used a lot of persuasive essays to try to convince people to join the American Revolution to fight for their freedom. And because this was like a unique period of time, people were writing in a very specific way. That's why we're covering it. So they give you a list of important writers here. The list they give you is Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Paine. You can find that right here. And then they explain that these were the people who spoke to the colonists and wrote articles that everyday people were reading about what was going on at the time. They tried to stress the individual rights of people. So that means they talked about how important it is for you as a person that exists to have the right to do certain things instead of just being ruled by a king telling you what to do all the time. They basically were spreading the idea that, yeah, there are people who are in charge, but there are certain things you should be allowed to do just because you are a person. And that's kind of the basis of a lot of the policy that we have in the US today. So that's why it's important to cover this. They also give you one more name here, which is Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis Wheatley is not one of the Age of Reason pamphlet or essay writers. Instead, she wrote poetry, so it was a little more artistic, but her poetry did have a message. She talked about and wrote about the importance of the revolution for to give rights to women and African Americans, because at the time African Americans were hoping that the independence from Britain would grant them additional rights as well. That turned out to not be the case across the board, but it is what they were hoping for. Then they tell you like some general facts about the writing at this time. They tell you that persuasive essays were published in pamphlets. So think of like those small printouts that people like try to hand you at events or whatever. There's only like a few pages, almost like a small magazine. That's basically what these pamphlets were. They were sheets of paper, like basically makeshift short like leaflets almost that were like folded with things printed on them. The printing press was a thing during this time. So if you wanted to get the word out about a specific way of thinking, what people would do is they would write kind of like an article with their thoughts and reasonings. They print a bunch of them and then they would actually hand them out to people on the street. And these were separate from newspapers. Newspapers published like news of the day and stuff, but these pamphlets were very specifically, here's an important essay about why I think we should be free from Britain and you should support us, kind of thing. Try to remember that the men who were listed here, so Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Paine, these people were very well known for the time. They were basically like important representatives of the colonies. They were basically celebrities, right? So imagine your favorite celebrity like Offset or Taylor Swift or anyone who is like famous for movies. If they wrote an article with their very real opinion about what's happening in the country, a lot of people will want to read that and pick that up, right? Because they already like that person, they like what they're doing, they feel like they're important. So that's pretty much how these became popular and were circulating around. They note here that 2,000 different pamphlets were published between 1763 and 1783. Now, this is the first number that we've seen in this tutorial, so I want to take a quick moment to remind you, if you are taking notes, important things to cover for notes are names. We kind of went over some of those. Dates, we just got those. Some of our numbers were dates. Explanations why things are important. That's kind of what we're going over now, why the Age of Reason was even important. And vocabulary. So if you see any words that you don't know that don't make any sense, like pamphlets, for example, you might want to look it up and take some notes on the definition if you don't think you'll remember. And lastly, any other numbers. So like the 2,000 different pamphlets, I will write that down also as well. Usually if they're giving you statistics, that's like numbers that are, the point of those numbers is to give you information. Those are things that should be in your notes. Part of the reason why is you might get a question on the mastery test asking, oh, how many different pamphlets were published during these years? And you have to fill in that blank, right? So usually if they give you a number and it's not like a table of numbers, then I would definitely write it down. Alrighty. And to finish off this slide, they tell you about pretty much literature and art and how that developed. Because these pamphlets that had essays in them were just people's thoughts about what was going on in the country and where the country should go in the future. That's not the same as the writing that people do for like plays, which were older versions of what we would call movies at this point, or musicians, right? So if you're writing songs, you're writing poems, that's art. It's not the same as giving people information. So that last paragraph tells you that art was also important. So it wasn't just people writing their opinions, it was also people expressing their emotions and how the events made them feel. So they talk about lots of theaters were built through the colonies. That's important to note. And artists were trying to celebrate the American identity. So what they mean by this is, as you've learned from the previous lessons, the colonists came over from Britain to settle America, right? So they were British people, and other sorts. There were some people from other countries that came as well, but just in terms of the colonies, mostly Britain. So they came over and had to build their own cities, settlements, towns, and stuff here. So when you do that, you're in a new place that's very unlike where you came from. You develop a way of life that's different from where you used to be, right? So when you develop that kind of culture for yourself, um, you kind of identify a bit differently than people who were back where you came from. If you've been living in the American colonies for 10 years, right? Your life is very different there, more than likely, than it was in Britain. So people who were in the American colonies had their own sense of self. They felt very different from typical British people because they were living differently. Imagine being a kid who was born in the American colonies, and even though your people are from Britain, you've never been there. You don't know what life is like there. You only know what life is like in America. So a lot of the art that came out at this time sort of celebrated the way of life, and that's what they mean by American identity, the way that they lived there. And then they cover a little bit after the Revolutionary War here. The last point they make is that a lot of universities were built in states after the Revolutionary War. So this is after America defeated Britain and solidified its independence. They wanted to push education, um, especially because logical arguments and writing was a part of the Age of Reason leading up to that. Alrighty. At this point, slide 6, I am going to advise taking a short break, grabbing some water or something. I have some tea here with me, and we are gonna take maybe a short break, pause the video, go to the bathroom, do what you have to do, and then come back because this timeline is pretty long and it covers a lot of stuff. This timeline basically gives you a full overview of all the important things that happened leading up to the American Revolution, and it's a long list of things. I took my own notes for this to record this video, and it did take a while. So definitely listen to the highlighted points that I have here, but you're gonna want to come back and take notes on how these things happen. You can also follow along, pause as I'm going and taking notes, but take a minute now to prepare yourself. Go get, your paper and pencil. If you didn't have anything before when we were going over slide 5, you're definitely gonna need it now. All right, so let's get into it. Slide 6, the timeline for the Age of Reason. It starts here in 1754. Remember, dates are important. So they talk about the French and Indian War starting. So the important thing to note about the French and Indian War is that it is not about the French and the Native Americans fighting each other. No, it's called the French and Indian War because the French and the Native Americans fought together. This war was basically named by the British, so they named the war after who they were fighting. Um, there were territories in North America, land pretty much, that France was trying to hold on to, pretty much. They were both going for land, both the French and the British. And France pretty much was trying to keep the British out of their spots. And the British felt like they were entitled to that land. So they were fighting over that. And at a certain point, what kicked off this war was George Washington fought in the very first battle. It was called the Battle at Forced Necessity, and that was the name of the fort that the French had. The British lost actually, and the reason why they lost was because the French had allied with and were fighting with Native Americans in the area. The Native Americans did not like the British, and they were willing to trade with the French to offer extra support so that they could outnumber the British. So that battle at Fort Necessity was the very first battle of the war. And very important. So the next thing is really the end of the war. That's the next significant event. So February 10th, 1763 is the Treaty of Paris. Now you might be wondering, what does Paris have to do with this? Yes, Paris is the capital of France. And the important thing here, one, usually treaties are named after either the countries that are involved or the place where they're signed. So this was signed in Paris, but because it was signed in Paris, you might be asking, oh, well, why wasn't it signed in America? Aren't they fighting in America? The problem here is the British and the French ended up fighting in Europe as well. So while they were fighting and they had troops fighting in America, they were also fighting over territory here. In Europe, the war that they were a part of is called the 7 Years' War. Technically they're different because obviously there's different people in different places, right? If you're fighting in Europe, that can't be the same set of battles as what's happening in America. But since they were started by the same event, basically they were fighting in Europe because of all the fighting they were already doing in America. The 7 Years' War and the French and India War are basically the same thing. So they ended up fighting in a couple other places. They fought in the Caribbean over territory too, which is why it kind of became an international war and not just in America. But the British ended up winning. And because they won when they signed the treaty, France gave up their land to the British. They gave up everything that they had conquered, held, settled east of the Mississippi. So if you've ever heard that phrase, east of the Mississippi River, this is where it comes from. The only place they didn't give up was New Orleans. And that kind of makes sense. If anyone knows about New Orleans or has ever been there, you know that there's a very heavy French influence there. And it's because they didn't have to give it up as part of this treaty. So they were able to stay there. Also important to note that the British did win this war, but it cost them so much. They had a lot of debt from all of the weapons and men that they were shipping back and forth and having to feed and everything. And this is like the foundation for all the stuff that goes down in the American colonies. And that's why it's important to note these things before we even get to the American Revolution. So try to remember that the American Revolution kind of happened because of the stress that this war put on people in America. And you're about to find out why the stress was there in just a moment. So this next article here is the Stamp Act. And that is from 1765. So in 1765, Britain put soldiers in the colonies, and they said that they did this to stop France from trying to recover the lands that they lost. So basically, they thought France was going to be a bunch of sore losers and try to like sneak and take back land. So they told the colonists that they were putting soldiers in their colonies to stop that from happening. Whether or not that's actually true, we don't really know. But when they did this, the king of Britain also decided that the colonists were going to have to help to pay for this, which is not great, right? Because the colonists didn't ask for the soldiers to be there. So not only are the soldiers there, but they also want the American colonies to help pay for it. Uh, so the Stamp Act was one of these things that they put in place, that the king and Britain put in place to help raise money. So when you add taxes to things, because that's what this act did, you have to pay extra on things that you buy, right? That's what we do here in the States. Each of our states has sales tax, for example. So the Stamp Act taxed anything that was a paper good. So this includes things like newspapers or legal docs, things that you're printing to sell. And because of that, the prices on these goods were increased. So you had to pay more. Um, and the reason why this was is because basically if you had something paper that you were trying to sell, you had to have like a special stamp on it to be able to sell it, and you had to pay for that. Like the stamp proved that the person who ordered it, like basically, um, was paying for the stamp. And so the way it would go is the merchant or the person selling would have to pay extra, and then they charge the colonists extra to make up for it, so they could break even, right? So a lot of Americans thought that was unfair because they didn't ask for it, and also this law was made back in Britain, and none of the colonists or colonies have representation there. So they couldn't just like write to anyone in Britain and say, hey, we don't want this. It's just that the king made a decision, Parliament, the government made a decision, and the colonists just had to deal with it. They didn't get any say. So the next one is the Townshend Acts, and that is from 1767 to 1770. So the fact that there's a second date there kind of tells you that this ended at some point. So the Townshend Acts were another list of taxes. So it wasn't just tax on paper, they added it to other things. It was named after the person who was in charge of the British Treasury. That's why it's called Townshend. His name was Charles Townshend. They tell you right here. And basically, these were lots of different taxes that were passed all at once. So things like lead, glass, tea, paint, and paper had extra taxes on them. And they also changed the law with these taxes so that the merchants, the sellers, could not just increase the price of the item to break even, right? They made it so that the sellers of the items had to pay taxes and they couldn't break even. They just had to pay a fee. And I guess they thought that that was going to stop everyday people from being upset about it since they wouldn't have to pay extra. But the people who are selling, the merchants, also are a group of people who are upset. Also, what this did was it established a customs agency to collect the taxes. So they basically built a new office and hired new British people to go around and making sure that they collected the taxes from anyone who was selling these kind of goods. The colonists basically protested a lot because they didn't like that. Um, and pretty much the merchants raised the prices on things anyway to reflect the new taxes. So everyone was upset. It didn't work out the way they wanted it to. And so they ended up being repealed. That's why there's the end date of 1770. So most of the taxes got repealed. Repealed is like a fancy legal term for this was voted to be taken back. They undid it. But they did not get rid of the tax on tea. So they started taxing a bunch of stuff. People were very unhappy, and then they were like, never mind. Except tea, though, you still have to pay extra for that. All right, this next one, March 5th, 1770, is the Boston Massacre. This is a very important event. So, pretty much, Boston over time became the center of the colonial resistance. It was a very important town. A lot of the like great minds of the time were living there and like writing things and studying things there. So it was kind of the hub of where people who didn't like having um the soldiers there and being ruled by Britain the way they were kind of like gathered to discuss things. And because there were so many people who gathered there and were very anti, like British rule, soldiers were sent there to keep order. They were like, hey, we can't just let you guys build opposition like right under our nose. So we're going to send some soldiers there. Now, this made kind of a lot of problems. So the soldiers were not paid very well. Remember that these are soldiers that were left over from the French and Indian War, right? So they've been here for a while. There's a very strong chance that the crown, like the king, is only keeping them there because it would cost more to get them back to Britain, right? They're kind of just there to scare the colonists into doing what the crown wants. So they're not being paid well, especially not as well as they were being paid while there was an actual war. And because of that, a lot of them had to actually get jobs. So on top of not being paid well and having to work on top of being a soldier, right? You think that that's enough, but you have to get a second job. A lot of the jobs that they got were jobs that people in the town actually wanted, right? So if you're living in this town, there's fewer jobs. Um, there's all these people here that don't know the way things work. They're kind of being pushy and entitled because they're British and not just American colonists. There was a lot of tension. People weren't happy with the situation. So the events on March 5th that ended up happening, now that we've sort of set the stage, um, there were some civilians, that means non-military people, harassing a British soldier that was on duty. They're basically, throwing stuff at him. They're like, go back, to Britain. We don't want you here, that kind of thing. More British soldiers showed up and they basically got the smoke too, right? So the colonists were like, oh, it doesn't matter if there's more of you. Like, we hate all of you guys. So they start throwing things, calling names and stuff. And eventually things escalated and some of the soldiers ended up firing into like a crowd of people. So like while these soldiers were being harassed, they were creating a lot of noise. More people from the city were like coming over to see what was going on, and the soldiers fired into the crowd. 5 people ended up dying, and the soldiers that shot into the crowd did end up being arrested, but the event was considered a massacre because at this time it was considered crazy for soldiers to just show up after taking up space in someone else's town and to just actually shoot them. So even though they were arrested and charged, the colonists were still upset. So basically, all the people who were against Britain at this time were just even more upset about the fact that the soldiers were even here for this to happen. The next event here is the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So this is in 1773. So there's a couple things happening. This is kind of a continuation of the Townshend Acts, right? So we just talked about how they repealed everything except the tea. So after this happened, the colonists started smuggling tea because they didn't want to pay taxes for it. They just were like, this is just dumb. We didn't get to decide this. We didn't get to vote on this. We're not going to do it. So they were smuggling tea in so that they could sell it for a lower price without the taxes. And then people would probably buy theirs because it costs less. So Britain noticed this and they passed the Tea Act, so that the British Tea Company, that was very famous at the time, could sell their tea directly to the colony. So they didn't have to go through the same process as the other businesses in the area, having to basically like register and pay taxes and things like that. Since the British Tea Company, the um, the British East India Company, there you go. Since they were natively British, it basically allowed them to bypass duty costs. So basically, duty is kind of like a fee that you pay um, for the purpose of being able to sell to another group of people, pretty much. If you've ever gone out of the country before, you're probably familiar with paying like duty prices. So it basically balances out whatever the currency difference is. So like the money differences is between how much something costs in another country versus um in the place that you came from. Sometimes duty also just has to do with additional taxes that you pay to sell things in another country, right? Uh, it's also known as a tariff. So basically, the important thing is they could sell their tea without any extra cost. So that's what the Tea Act did. Now, because of this, the British East India Company's tea cost less than the smuggler's tea. So that's kind of how this got started. So to retaliate against this and kind of punish Britain for passing laws, they're like, okay, so you're going to make us pay more. And then when we try to smuggle it so we don't have to, they're going to undercut us by selling it even cheaper. No, we're not doing that. So this guy named Sam Adams uh, got a group of 50 people in Boston to sneak onto one of the British East India Company, like the one of the ships that was bringing in the tea at night. And what they did was they dressed up as Native Americans from the Mohawk tribe because they thought that that would throw the British off their trail, I guess. And they snuck onto the ship and dumped 45 tons, not pounds, tons of tea into the harbor. They just picked up the crates and just dumped them. And this is kind of like a famous event. I'm sure that you might have heard a reference to the Boston Tea Party somewhere. It's referenced in movies, it's referenced in um, all kinds of places, movies, books. Um, and if you've taken a government or history class with us, you may have seen it mentioned there too. But because this was like a really big sort of screw you to Britain, it's considered to be one of the biggest representations of the colonies resisting Britain. It's iconic in that sort of way. All right, so the next event here is the Intolerable Act. So this is 1774. And this is directly the year after the Boston Tea Party. So after the tea got dumped, the powers in Britain, the king and parliament, decided that they were going to punish anyone who lived in Massachusetts for doing that. And they did this by passing these intolerable acts. They're also called the coercive acts. So intolerable means something that you cannot tolerate. And the reason why they're called that is because these are the acts that were passed that really tipped the scales in favor of the colonies deciding they couldn't be ruled by Britain anymore. They decided we're not doing this anymore. So they're called the intolerable acts because they're what made the colonies decide not to tolerate Britain anymore. They are also known as the coercive acts. And the reason why they're called the coercive acts is because coercing is to convince someone or trick someone into doing something. And the entire point of all of these acts was to try to push the colonies to follow all of the rules, basically. So you went and did this, you dumped our tea, so now we're gonna make you pay by passing laws that make your life more difficult. So if you would just follow all of the rest of the rules, then we won't have any problems. They're kind of threatening them, right? So there's four of them. They go down this list here. The Boston Port Act, they pretty much give it to you straight here. It closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for all the tea that they had destroyed. So they couldn't ship anything to or from Massachusetts until they paid for all the tea that they dumped, which is crazy, right? Because you have to think about all the things that come in on boats. It's not just tea, it's like materials so that people can build things. It's medicines that may be made of things that you can't easily get in America. Um, it also means that if anyone is trying to come back home, like say they went to visit family in Britain that doesn't live in America and they try to come back, they can't even get back in, which is nuts, right? So they're inconveniencing everyone in the hopes of trying to make it so that the people will say, oh, well, look what you did. You made Britain angry, so just don't do this anymore. The second one here, the Massachusetts Government Act, it says it revoked, that means like denied, the colony's charter and reduced the colonists' political rights. So basically, you know how every state has like their own rules? We have like state constitutions and things like that. The colonies also had their own versions of these. And Britain basically said, oh, you don't get to make rules for yourself anymore. You have to follow ours, and we say you get to do this, this, and this. That's pretty much what this did. It undid all of the work that the colonists had done to sort of like shape their own way of life there. The next one is the Administration of Justice Act. So administration means uh to basically um distribute work. So administration are I'm sure you've seen it in terms of work, like having a job, but usually administration is a group of people that have power spread among them to run things. So administration of justice is basically spreading the work of justice around. And the reason why it's called this is it allowed British officials accused of a crime in the colonies to be tried in Britain. So instead of having the power to judge someone in a court in America, it spread that power to Britain so that people had to be shipped there. Now, part of the reason why they did this was because they knew that if they could just ship people to Britain to be tried, no one would ever know if they actually went to prison or actually went to court. So, for example, those guys that committed the Boston Massacre, if they had to be shipped off to Britain to be tried, there's no way to know. Did they actually have to pay a fine? Did they actually have to go to jail? Or were they just released once they got off the boat to go back to their families? So they took the right to judge people legally out of the hands of the colonies so that they couldn't punish people for things that were done to the colonists, which is really messed up. And the last one is the Quartering Act. It says this required colonists to provide housing for British soldiers. So remember, we were talking about how the British soldiers were being paid really badly and a lot of them had to get extra jobs. This law, quarters as in a place to stay, right? So we say like military will say like military places will have a saying that's like go back to your quarters, things like that. Quarters used to be like barracks where people are housed. So the Quartering Act means basically like a housing act. So you've got these people here. They don't want to be here. They're not being paid. They're taking jobs from other people in the colonies. And now families have to make room to have soldiers, the same ones that are harassing them and enforcing all these rules, live with them in their homes. So Britain just wanted to make things unbearable so that the colonists were discouraged from acting up again, basically. All right. So this next one is the First Continental Congress. So continental just means within the continent. So this is basically everyone from the colonies meeting or having a Congress. A Congress is a type of like, it's a fancy word for like meeting to decide things. So that's the breakdown there. This was basically for a couple months. So September 5th to October 26th, this was in the same year, which is 1774. So this was a big meeting with delegates, and they give you a lot of numbers here. So 56 delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And so these were people that were chosen by those who lived in the cities to like represent what the colonists wanted. The same way that we have Congress now, like you vote for people in your state to be in Congress, they basically did this here. They all of the people from the colonies chose other people to represent them and then sent them to have this meeting about what would be best for the colonies. Now you might be thinking, I thought there were 13 colonies. Why are there 56 delegates from 12 colonies? That is true. The one colony that did not send any representation was Georgia. Georgia did not send any delegates, but they basically said, we'll go along with whatever it is you say. So just tell us what you decide. Now, just to break this down a little bit more, to delegate means to put someone else in charge or in a position to represent other people. So it literally means someone that was chosen to represent a group of people. Now, what did they do there? They discussed the intolerable acts, right? Because they were just passed. So they're talking about these acts and how they affect the country. And they kind of like strategize for, well, what can we do to get better treatment from Britain? Because obviously, Britain thinks that they can just rule over us and dismantle all the work that we've done. Like, you have to think about it from their perspective, right? The colonists are what made the colonies successful. They're the people that tested planting things, building things, going out to explore, going out to map things, figuring out where money could be made in terms of sending things back to Britain, in terms of just figuring out what was in America that was unique or special, etc. And so they felt like they deserved better treatment than to just be another colony because they were doing what they felt was a lot of work. And for Britain to come in when they don't know anything about the way of life here, they basically pushed people into the colonies just to get them out of Britain in the first place. You might remember from some of the previous lessons, they talked about people who were being religiously persecuted, right? So people who didn't agree with Puritan life views or religion type views basically pushed the Puritans to leave. And that's how they got to America in the first place. So the chain of events here is, okay, so you told us to get out. We got out. We went to America. We start becoming successful at actually making money. And then you want to do this? That's not fair. You wouldn't even have this if it wasn't for us coming in here to do work to make it what it is today, is basically how they felt about it. And what they ended up deciding at this Continental Congress was to boycott British commerce. So they basically decided to not buy things that were brought in from Britain, to give them as little money as possible. They also decided to send a letter to King George. Now, in this paragraph, it says here they agreed to boycott British commerce, but commerce is basically, so it has the same root word as commercial, right? So in commercial is like to sell something, something that's valuable that you can sell to get something from. So basically, this is a word that means like business. So they're boycotting British business and products. And then they sent a letter to King George. Now, the next thing here is Phillis Wheatley. That's one of the writers that was mentioned before on the last slide. Phillis Wheatley wrote a poem called To His Excellency General Washington. Now, this was pretty much a poem that talks very highly about the bravery of George Washington and his army. And I believe that this was covered in either the previous tutorial or the one right before that. So you guys should have read it already. But she sent it to him in this year, and this year would be 1775. He actually thanked her for writing this poem and asked if she wanted to meet him in person. Alrighty. Next, we have April 18th, 1775 to April 19th. So basically just a day. So these are the battles of Lexington and Concord. So these are both mentioned together because they kind of happened basically around the same time. So we're going to go over the chain of events. So one of the British generals, his name was Thomas Gage, he sent soldiers to confiscate or take weapons that the colonists were saving. So they knew that it was possible that they might get into some battles with the British soldiers. So a lot of the colonists were like, okay, well, let's get us some weapons and we'll stash them here. That way, if we need them, we can come grab them. Um, but the general found out about it and was like, okay, we're going to go grab those because that's like very dangerous. We don't want to have to fight a bunch of colonists with weapons. We want to keep the upper hand, right? So he sent 700 soldiers to capture the weapons that were there. And they were stored at Concord. And Concord is a city that's near Boston. Remember, Boston is the center of where all the resistance is happening. Now, this is when Paul Revere made his famous ride. So if you have had history classes before, you might remember Paul Revere. He's they've like made jokes and references. He's like the British are coming, the British are coming kind of thing. There have been different movies and stuff about that. So you may have seen it. But basically, he rode the entire evening, like the entire night, so like upwards of 10 to 12 hours, um, to spread the word that the British soldiers were coming that way to try to take the weapons. And it's an exhausting amount of time to actually be up and riding. And he's trying to move faster than the soldiers, right? So that he can let people know ahead of time what's happening. So the next morning, because Paul Revere wrote all night warning people, basically a small town named Lexington, which was like on the way to Concord, a bunch of colonists got together and tried to stop the British soldiers there before they could reach all the weapons that were at Concord. So they were very outnumbered. There were more British soldiers than there were colonists. Um, but they managed to sort of like stall them in enough time for the colonists from the main force at Concord to actually get themselves together and organize with the weapons that they had stored. And because Paul Revere did this and warned them in advance, and the people at Lexington had a small battle that delayed them, the people at Concord were able um, to get their stuff together to actually fight a good fight once the British got there. The colonists actually defeated the British, which no one was really expecting. And also because everyone knew what the British were doing, when they were on their way back from losing this battle, they also had to worry about being attacked by other colonists with weapons on their way back. So they suffered almost 300 casualties. So they sent 700 and they only came back with 400, which is a lot, especially when we're talking about formally trained soldiers like fighting kind of like everyday people. Alrighty, we are close-ish to the end of the timeline. I'd say we're maybe about halfway through. Alrighty. From 1775, May 10th to July 4th, 1776. That is the Second Continental Congress. So this was way longer than just a month. So this time, delegates from all 13 colonies met again, because at this point, right, they sent the letter, they've been boycotting the stuff that the British is selling, but they're still going back and forth. There's still fighting that's happening. The British are not backing off. So they got together again and said, hey, we got to like figure this out. Like, we can't just keep struggling like this. We got to figure out what we're going to do. So this is where it was decided that the colonies were going to declare themselves independent of Britain. They voted to do this. And they also voted to create the American Continental Army. So basically, if you create an army, that can be seen as like an act of war, right? Because you don't make an army unless you're planning to fight. So they knew that they were going to be punished by the British once they declared independence. And they were like, well, we're almost at war with Britain anyway. So we might as well go ahead and just create the army and make it official. So that's what they decided to do. And they decided that George Washington, who you might remember from the Battle of Necessity, that's when he was first mentioned, the very, very first event on this timeline. Even though he lost that battle, he had won and managed to successfully lead lots of small forces throughout the colonies while all of this sort of like tit for tat fighting was happening. And he had a really great reputation, both as a man and a leader. So he was voted to be the leader of the official American army. And then the next point here was that John Adams, Ben Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson, they created the Declaration of Independence. So they got together and wrote that. And it basically is a document that, and you'll be reading it in this lesson, but it pretty much voices all of the colonists' reasons for splitting from Britain. So you have to think about it this way, right? You know what the world is like. Lots of countries fight over territory. Very often, what ends up happening is small rebellions happen in different countries, and there's fighting over who's going to be in charge. The American colonists didn't want this to be like any other war. They didn't want this to just be like, oh, I don't like who's ruling over me, so screw that, I'm going to fight. They wanted to be able to try to convince the other powers of the world that it made sense for them to separate from Britain. Because if they didn't, Britain could just potentially team up with the other countries, right? And just fight everyone and basically kill or get rid of anyone who didn't want the colonies to be ruled by Britain. But by writing the Declaration of Independence, they basically are sending a message that's saying there are some things that's bigger than just being in charge. And that's why the Declaration of Independence talks so much about the rights that people have, the different types of reaching out that they did to Britain to try to reach an agreement, and the way that the king has kind of been putting all these petty laws into place that don't even really benefit anyone, since it's causing all this conflict and infighting. People are avoiding the taxes by smuggling. People are taking out members of the British Army who could probably be doing much better things at back home, right? But instead, they don't want to let the colonists just sort of like be who they are and respect the life that they've built in America. So they make all these points and send it to not just King George, but they also make sure that other people have access to it. They want everyone to see it so that everyone knows, hey, we're not just complaining about having to work hard or whatever. We're willing to work hard. We're willing to do what it takes to keep this country afloat. But what we're not going to do is let someone make rules that literally don't make any type of sense and don't benefit anyone really. Even Britain's not getting what they want to get from having these laws in place. So if the king is actually just a really crappy ruler instead of just, like a ruler that has to make tough decisions, then why should we have to follow that? And that was kind of the point behind the Declaration of Independence. And it says here, of course, the Continental Congress accepted, the document on July 4th, 1776. So this is when it was voted to be in its final form. Everyone agreed with what was in it. And they were like, yeah, this represents us pretty well. And that's why we celebrate, like 4th of July, right? So the next thing here is Thomas Paine's individual pamphlets. So remember, pamphlets are the essays that were being circulated and printed right at the time. So this is from 1776, the same year that the Declaration of Independence was voted in. Ratified is the official word. That means like officially legally accepted. Um, but also during this year, he published, Thomas Paine published these pamphlets and he published them anonymously. These are some of the important points here. He published them anonymously, so they weren't under his name. He published Common Sense. That's the name of the one of the first pamphlets in January of that year. Remember, this is 1776. And it argued in favor of seeking independence. So he was explaining in this pamphlet for people who are like skeptical or who don't understand why. He was explaining why they should seek independence because this was something that everyone was debating about at the time. He sold more than 100,000 copies in a few months, which is major for this time period. And later, he published The American Crisis. Crisis is like a really big problem or dilemma. And it basically, the American Crisis pretty much motivated the colonists and the American army after the Declaration of Independence was like ratified. So it was supposed to just sort of explain this is why it's important for us to fight for this. In case you had any doubts about if we're doing the right thing, let me tell you some things about what's happening. It was supposed to be motivational. Alrighty. Next, in 1783, we have Noah Webster's spelling book. So you might be familiar with Noah Webster. He has a dictionary. It's just this was kind of before that was official. So Noah Webster published the spelling book, and it was written to teach American children how to read and write because there were a lot of them who couldn't. A lot of the work that was done in the colonies was farm type of work, harvesting the land type of thing. So not everyone needed to read and write, but there was a really big emphasis on the importance of people being able to understand what was written in like these pamphlets and in the Constitution when it was passed, right? So he sold more, I believe, than 100 million copies by the end of the 1800s. So this is like over 20 years, not quite as like impressive as just like the first couple of months of Thomas Paine's things. But he basically standardized spellings, or at least took a big step towards it. So his spelling book basically said, here are words. Here is how you spell these words. And this was very important because a lot of the writings at the time, people wrote things the way that they sounded. So by publishing this spelling book, he was like, here's the official way you spell these words. Everyone should be spelling them the same way. All right, next up is the Federalist Papers. So this was written by Alexander Hamilton and James Madison and John Jay. They did it under like a group name, so they didn't do it with their names. Remember that people are still, like fighting the British at the time. There's still a lot of people who are like arguing about, well, should we be independent from Britain? Should we not? So you didn't want to have your actual name on a lot of these things. So they got together and formed a group called Publius, which is basically the Latin word for publishing. And this was in 1787, as you can see up here. But basically, the Federalist Papers was another pamphlet, and it urged or pushed citizens to accept the U.S. Constitution. So at this point, we've got the Constitution. We've officially, like declared independence. And the Constitution was like the rules of the land, right? So that's like the foundation of like America's laws. So they were urging people, hey, these laws are good. They're good for this reason. Here's the things that these laws can help us do as a society. Think about it. And they gave insight to the thinking of the founding fathers. So the Federalist Papers, since these people were partially at the Continental Congress or knew people who were, they were able to offer explanations to people like, hey, if you're wondering why this was in the Constitution, why this is in the Declaration of Independence, here's what people were thinking at the Congress when they discussed this, so that there's no mystery behind what the intentions were. That's kind of very important. When people write laws, it's important for people to know why they're there. So the Federalist Papers was kind of like the behind the scenes peek, right, at what the point of the laws were, to make sure that people understood what they were meant for and didn't use them for things they weren't meant for. All right, we are almost done. We're in the home stretch. I told you guys this was going to be a long section, so. All right, so we have the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. This is in 1793. Benjamin Franklin was a major player in not just the Declaration of Independence, but also just in general in terms of like politics at the time. He spoke in Britain in favor of the colonists. He was able to help a lot of people understand and learn things. He was considered a scientist. He did research on electricity. He just was a very well-known, like, intellectual, like he was the country's considered to be by a lot of people the country's smartest person. So this is his autobiography. Auto means you wrote it yourself, just as a reminder. So autobiography is a story of your life that you wrote yourself. If someone else writes it, it's just a biography. So this was very well received. Everybody was kind of waiting for this. He wrote this himself, so you got some insight on his thoughts in terms of the different things that influenced him in life, ideas, philosophies, stuff that he thought was important. Like, imagine the wisest person you know, right? The person you respect the most, writing a book with all their thoughts about things that they've gone through in life. This was pretty much what that was for a lot of the colonists. And it pretty much just like covered a lot of things related to his interests and things that he cared about. Alrighty. And the very last one is 1795. This is George Washington's farewell address. So this is well after we won independence from Britain. So George Washington was our first president, right? So this was his goodbye to the people after he served his second term. So we're jumping, like quite ahead of the timeline in terms of the American Revolution. This was a letter that he wrote after his second term as president. So he knew that he was well loved as president. He knew that people wanted him to stay in office for longer. He's considered to be one of America's greatest presidents. But because the law is that no one can stay in power for too long here, because they tried to, like avoid the president basically being a king. When his second term was up, even though people were trying to convince him, oh, you should stay for another 4 years, you should, change the law so you can stay longer. George Washington basically was like, but if I do that, I'm no different than a king that changes the law so that he can be in power forever instead of passing it to like his sons or nephews or whatever. And he didn't want to be like that. So in this letter, he talks about his service to the nation, like, so all the things he's done in the army and as president. And he writes down what he thinks are important warnings for issues that he thinks that the country might have in the future. So he talks about not just issues that he thinks we might have with other countries. He talks about things that you might want to worry about in terms of people, how they think, how they can be easily taken advantage of or deceived. He talks about basically not falling back into becoming the same sort of place that Britain was, that they were trying to free themselves from. This also touched on, so like one of the things he warned about was political parties and how they were formed. And he also talked about long-term alliance with other nations. So pretty much he talked about how dangerous it is to have parties that push weird or dangerous things. He mostly just talked about how loyalty to a group instead of the idea of freedom can be a bad thing. So like if you're allied with a country for a very long time and you notice that they're doing something that's wrong or incorrect, you still have to stand up like against them, right? So he warned about that in terms of outside allies and political parties. Like just because a political party um, is something that you want to believe in, if the people in it basically are trash, then you have to hold them accountable and not go with what they're doing just because you've been there for a long time. So that was a big theme in some of what he talked about. Okay, now we just got through the timeline. There is still quite a bit left to this lesson. So this is another part where you're going to want to take a little break, pause the video, go get some water, go to the bathroom, meet me back here, and we're going to start off on slide number 8. All right. Hopefully you paused and took a break. If you didn't, hopefully you've got the stamina to last through the rest of this. All of that up until this point was kind of the history behind what we're learning in this lesson. So that was just the setup. That was just the setup. So now we're truly getting into the actual like point of this lesson. So slide 8 is called Persuasive Texts and Revolutionary Perspectives. So persuasive text is when you're using your words to try to convince someone of something. We kind of covered that already. But then we have perspectives, right? So perspectives are like ways of thinking. Someone's like the way that they think, the way that they express ideas. How does a person view things? That's what a perspective is. So revolutionary perspectives are ways that people saw things during the revolution. Now, there's a list here of concepts that you should be familiar with before you start this lesson. And these are directly from the previous lessons in this unit. So if any of these sound unfamiliar, I will recommend that you pause this, save it for later, and watch the videos on the previous lessons, or go back to the tutorials before this one and read through them again and then come back. Because I sometimes I try to stop and explain things, but if we stop and explain every single thing on this list, this video will be even longer. The previous videos do cover these things, so do go back and take a look if you need to. But already, assuming that you are prepared, that you paused, went to go see things and come back, we're just gonna dive right in. So this slide basically talks about using evidence to support conclusions. That's this subtitle right here. And that's what you're trying to do when you're convincing someone of something, right? People don't want to just believe something that you said just because you could have made it up. You have to prove that it makes sense and that it's true, right? So they talk about what people do to make their arguments sound. You're going to see this word a lot. Sound, sound evidence, sound arguments, that kind of thing. If something is sound, it means that it is well built. It means that it's airtight. It means that it makes sense, it's sturdy, and it's going to last a long while. So if you're using sound evidence, it's good evidence that makes sense and that people can follow and that it's hard to argue against, right? So to make evidence and an argument that is sound, you need things like specific facts, you need data, you need references, personal examples, and expert opinions. Now, I'll go through these and just sort of break it down in case you don't know what these are. Specific facts kind of speaks for itself. It is a fact that is directly related to the point you're making. Data is information. You need a lot of information, and not just information that you made up. You want information that came from studying, that came from truthful reports of things that actually happen. References are very similar. References are basically you referencing, looking at things that are related that connect to the point you're trying to make. Personal examples help because they give kind of like a human element to things. You have a living example from a person of something that you're trying to prove. Usually, personal examples work really well to just prove that something exists, right? That it's a possibility. And then you can hit them with the information about it. So not only do I have an example that this is real, but here's information from other people that have done it, some study or something like that. And then the last one is expert opinions. So someone who is very well studied on the topic that you're trying to convince someone about. So you might have heard the saying, right? You don't want to call like a you don't want a pilot when you need a doctor or something like that, right? You want someone that's an expert in what you're looking for to give you information about the thing you're studying. I wouldn't want to ask like a construction worker about writing, right? Because that's not their area of expertise. Now, if I'm building a house, then I can go to a construction worker and say, hey, what is your experience with this? What do you think I should do? But expert opinions should relate directly to what you're trying to say. Alrighty. The next slide, number 9, we talk about empirical evidence. So they give you the definition of what this is. Empirical evidence, excuse me, is evidence that is based on facts, especially statistically and scientific information. So statistics are numbers that come from a study. So if you know how many people do a thing or suffer from a thing or have issues with something, you're able to represent like how often it happens. So statistics are numbers that come from data from study and scientific information. So what do we know about this thing based on the research that was done? Usually these are things that people accept to be true. If something is empirical evidence, it's proven, right? Like these are facts that have already been proven. They've done the experiments, they've looked at the information, it's probably available so you can also look at it and see that something is true. So that's really strong evidence. And they give you an example of what empirical evidence does. So basically, this appeals to logical people, people who want to see, is this actually an issue? Does this actually help? Did someone try this? What were the actual results? And they give you an example down here of from Thomas Paine's Common Sense, which we mentioned earlier. He basically provides numbers to support his argument and prove his point. And he talks about how much like things cost here. And because he has these numbers, most of the time, people will take that to mean, okay, well, someone had to count these, someone had to actually calculate these, so it's official. So that's an example of logic, right? So if you're looking at the numbers, if you know that the numbers are actually true, that someone didn't make them up, you know, maybe they're official. So like for example, when the government does like the census, right? They send the form out to everyone, they count who sends it back. Everyone's encouraged to do it. So the numbers that they have are mostly accurate, right? And they get the stamp of approval, right, from the government. There's other types of documents and numbers and things like that that go through official sources. So if they come from official things like the government or like a very well-known organization, like if you get documentation from your doctor, right, you know that your doctor or someone at the office had to look at it to approve of it, right? That's not the same as someone just typing up something in Microsoft Word and saying, oh, you need this, right? So that's the point of empirical evidence. It's more official, right? You know that it actually had to go through people whose job it is to approve those things. So that's very convincing. The next type of evidence on slide 10, we talk about anecdotal evidence, right? So anecdotal evidence is evidence that's based on brief, true stories as examples. If it's something that someone made up, it's not anecdotal. So this is kind of like what we were talking about with personal examples. That's basically what an anecdote is. So you're pulling from things that actually happened to make a point. What makes it convincing is that it actually did happen. So even if it doesn't speak to like overall points, it does actually give you a solid example of what happened to at least one person. And that's sometimes useful for making a point. So they give you this second example here at the bottom. And this is also from Common Sense. with Thomas Paine. And in this excerpt, he basically talks about how the struggles that the colonists are going through in 1776, he compares it to a previous invasion of Britain. So, like, we all know Britain has conquered a lot of different lands, a lot of different people. So he's comparing the struggle that the colonists are going through to one of those other things. And he's specifically talking about William the Conqueror subduing England. It says he gave them law at the sword, and until we consent that seat of government in America be legally and authoritatively occupied, we shall be in danger of having it filled by some unfortunate ruffian who may treat us in the same manner. And then where will be our freedom? Where our property? So he's basically saying that if we don't, he's basically saying that if we don't assert our independence, we're going to be subdued the same way that England was conquered. And he's comparing it to that to say we don't want to be like England being conquered by William the Conqueror. He's pointing out that the cycle is basically for a land to just be dominated by a bigger power, and people can't do anything about it. And he does not want that to happen to America, especially if they're going to be ruled the same way that King George is ruling Britain right now. He also points out at the end, filled by some unfortunate ruffian. So he's saying that the people on the throne are not very respectable. A ruffian is like kind of like someone who isn't very respectable. And it says, who may treat us in the same manner. So he means treat the colonists the same way that William the Conqueror subdued England, right? And then it says, and then where will our freedom? Where will be our freedom? Where our property? So he's pointing out that if the American colonies are conquered the same way that England was, they won't have the same rights that they currently have. And since this is something that did actually happen in history, it's considered credible, right? There was a person named William the Conqueror. He did actually take over England. So this is like based on fact, which brings us to our next point. Let's see. On slide 12, it's important to note, and they tell you about this here, anecdotal evidence does give you examples of things that have actually happened. It is based in truth. However, it's important to note that all the details when someone gives you an anecdote may not be correct, right? It's not the same as cold, hard numbers or information that's been verified, like gone through many hands and been confirmed over and over. People can react emotionally to these stories, but sometimes the stories might not have anything to do with the point that are being made, or even if they do make a valid point, the point might not mean as much to the overall argument as it seems. So they point out here basically that anecdotal evidence is not always accurate and it's not always as logical. It's very easy to get upset at hearing a story about how sad or wrong something is and to kind of get up in arms about it and lose sight of the point. So usually anecdotal evidence is considered to be emotional appeal, not logical appeal, because it's a story that's based in truth, but it is still like a story in the sense that it's an example. So for example, someone could tell you about the number of shelter dogs that had to be put down in your city this year, right? And they tell you a very sad story of one dog that had to be put down. And so they want you to vote for a law that doesn't, maybe a law that dictates that you can't actually put down dogs in shelters anymore. But you have to think about the actual logic of that. Hearing the story of one dog being put down, that doesn't give you any real information other than that one situation is very sad. There are other questions that you should be asking, right? How many dogs were actually put down this year in that city? If it was only one or two because the shelters were filled, that's actually pretty good. Maybe you want to compare the number of pets that have been put down in your town to other towns to see if your number is really high or low. If your number is really low, then maybe the law isn't actually needed. And they just told you a sad story to get you to vote for that, right? If that one animal was the only one that was put down this year, then your city might be doing really good. Maybe there are other things that you can push too, other than just making it illegal to put down dogs, because some dogs are sick. They make other shelter dogs sick. Some are just too old and they're probably not going to be adopted. Other solutions, maybe you can push for an adoption program, for a fostering program, so that more dogs get taken and the shelters aren't as filled, right? So that's an example of how anecdotal evidence, it is based in truth, but sometimes it's not the most important thing to keep in mind in an argument. An example of this related to the Thomas Paine thing is the fact that they are bringing up William the Conqueror in terms of how he conquered England. But conquering England is not exactly the same situation as what's happening during the Revolution. America kind of developed in its own unique circumstance. And that's not to say that there's no comparison that you can make at all. But someone way back in the day conquering a land is a bit different than all the back and forth fighting and taxes, tit for tat back and forth that the colonies and the king have had. So even though it helps to make people angry about being conquered because they don't want to be, it might not be the best argument for what is actually happening in America at that time. And that's why they've spent the last couple lessons teaching you about logical appeal, emotional appeal. They want you to be able to read an argument and tell, okay, these numbers make sense. Do they actually help the argument? Or this story is great, but is it actually true? Does it actually help make the point that this is trying to make? Okay. One of the things that they tell you here that's important, Paine compares the British king's oppressive nature to a domineering invader of the past. And that's basically what he's doing. But he doesn't go into detail about the similarities. He just says, remember when this happened? Doesn't that make you mad? He doesn't give you any detail that actually shows that these situations are related. So you got to have kind of like a really close eye on anecdotal evidence. Now, at the bottom, it says here, when evaluating persuasive texts, you should assess the evidence presented to make sure it's credible and verifiable. So make sure you can actually find the information somewhere and that they didn't either make it up or pull it from some crazy person who you can't prove actually studied any of this. Verify facts using independent sources and examine sources for their reliability and trustworthiness. So take a look at, like, can I trust this? You know, that's very important. All righty, moving on to slide 14. So I've mentioned this before. We're not going over the reading selection. There's a separate video for that. But we are going to go over information about Thomas Paine because he is the person who wrote the reading selection for this lesson, which is the crisis number 1. So remember we talked about the American crisis when he published that. That was part of the timeline. So we're just going to go over the kind of like the background and history of this man who wrote it. So he was a revolutionary writer from Britain. He came to the colonies in 1774, and he came after meeting Ben Franklin. So he met Benjamin Franklin. He was so inspired, he came to America. So he wrote Common Sense in 1776, which basically challenged what he thought were the injustices or bad things that monarchies and hereditary rule did. So we're going to highlight this really quick, monarchies and hereditary rule. So a monarchy is basically a system of government that has a king or queen. That's the simplest way to put it. And hereditary rule is when a title is passed down from being in a family, right? So you're the king. That means that your son becomes the next king. Their son becomes the next king, right? So hereditary is passing through the bloodline. Now, there are problems with just making someone king because they're related to someone else. They might not be a good king. They might not live very long enough to actually like make change. They might not care about what the people want and only care about what rich people want. They might end up being really bad at war, for example. They don't know how to orchestrate battles, um, and things like that. They might have like weird ideas that are based on their family's ideas instead of following what the people are interested in. So all of these things are super important. Um, so we have this after the start of the Revolutionary War, Paine traveled with the Continental Army to report on its progress. So he was actually there, and that's very important. Um, let's see. He was also a major factor leading to the Declaration of Independence. I'm sorry, I missed that part. It was a little bit out of order. Um, But yeah, he traveled with the Continental Army and reported on what was going on. So he's a direct source to what was happening there. And then he published The American Crisis while doing that. It says here General Washington had the very first one, which is part of what you're reading today, read to the Continental Army to help raise spirits. So that tells you it was kind of a motivational sort of, this is why we're fighting, keep up the good fight. What made Paine different is what this last category, this last paragraph covers. He addressed the common people instead of the elite. So he didn't just write for people who were rich, who were super well educated. He addressed a lot of the issues that the common people had because those are the people who make up the nation. He wasn't super famous. He didn't come from any bloodline of people who was especially smart or anything like that. So he actually used very straightforward language instead of formal language. And he did that because he thought everyone is capable of understanding the government and politics. He thought that government and politics are for everyone because everyone should be affected by, like, if you're all affected by the rules and the laws that get passed, then everyone deserves to know what's going on. Uh, and again, he didn't have a bunch of money. He didn't have any famous family or anything. So this was kind of like uh a very big part of like his background and why he wrote for the everyday person. All right, the next slide is strategy for reading. So again, I'm not going over the crisis number one because that's reading that all the way through and breaking it down is a separate video. But it is here at the bottom of this slide in case you miss it. I feel like this is very easy to miss. But I will go over the strategy for readings, right? So the summary of this slide is pretty much to make a chart that lists all of the claims that are made. So if someone makes a statement in the crisis, or if Paine makes a statement in the crisis, any statement that sounds like something they want you to believe is true, it makes sense to sort of write down what that point is and then try to connect it to what he says afterwards to make the point. Because that's what an argument is, right? You don't just say, oh, this one thing has to be a fact, right? What you end up doing is making your point and then saying, I think that this is true because. Does that make sense? So you want to try to keep track of what it is he's saying that is true and what is he saying that is supposed to support that. They also give you 3 questions to consider, and these might also be helpful. So what is his main argument in the crisis number 1? What is the main argument he's trying to make? Can you find it in there? What type of evidence do you notice that he uses? And how does he use different kinds of evidence to support his claims? So does he use numbers? Does he use information? Does he tell you a story? You have to be able to go through the reading and actually point those different things out. Because if you don't know what those different things are, then basically anyone can convince you of anything, right? You don't know how to break down an argument. You don't know how to tell what makes sense and what doesn't. So that's kind of what they're building up into in this lesson. The second question is, how does he convey, that means tell you, express, right? How does he convey his opinion? So like, what types of words does he use? Does he sound upset? Does he sound excited? Does he sound angry? What does he seem passionate about in this writing? Because these are his personal thoughts and not like just a story, right? And then the first line of this is, these are the times that try men's souls. So try means like to judge, right? So these are the times that judge men's souls. So basically, these are times that show who you are, right? That let other people see what kind of man, what kind of person you are. And it is one of the most famous lines from the American Revolution era writings. So, what does he mean by this? Can you figure that out by reading? So, even though we are not going through the reading selection one, like line by line, one by one, I am going to um, go over the analysis on the next page. It'll be pretty quick. So pause this, take some time to read the selection. Even if you're having a difficult time with it, see if you can get your hands on the video for this reading selection. Some of the reading selections are up and have videos. I know for sure that this one does. So I would try to get your hands on that one. And if you don't have it, you can schedule tutoring to have someone go over the reading for you before you get to the next part. And if this is your first time going through the slides, try to understand as much as possible, and then hop over to the analysis. We'll be on the next slide, number 16, and we'll see if that helps. Okay, so the analysis, I'm just gonna hit the main points, right? So the main point is to persuade the readers of the importance of declaring independence. He's explaining why it's important that we fight to do this, why it's important for the people at the time to fight for freedom. He was traveling with the Continental Army, so he has access to information that other people wouldn't. So he could be considered expert opinion because he was there. And he uses a lot of anecdotal, so remember those are like true stories, and empirical evidence. So he has numbers about what the army is doing, how many people are there, how many weapons they have, how long they've been traveling. He's got a good mixture of both. He's got stories from being there, and he has numbers and information from being there. And the goal of this excerpt here he talks about once more we are again collecting and collecting. Our new army at both ends of the continent is recruiting fast, and we shall be able to open the next campaign with 60,000 men well armed and clothed. So he's giving you numbers, 60,000 men. He's saying that they're recruiting fast, right? So he wants you to trust him because he's there. So he's trying to prove that the forces are growing and replenishing, right? Because when people fight, they die. And the fewer people you have, the lower your chances of winning. So he's trying to give everyone, confidence by saying, oh, don't worry about it. But what you have to pay attention to is how reliable is this information? Where did these numbers come from? Does he have documents to support it, or did he just look out into the crowd and guess it's probably 60,000, right? So that's what I mean when I say it's important for you to think about how convincing something is. Now, if you're citing paperwork that's official, then that's different. But if you're just sort of guesstimating off the top of your head, uh, he might be biased. He might be, like kind of puffing the numbers up a bit, right? You have to have someone verify that information. Is there army paperwork that confirms that they have 60,000 men? Because Payne is like he's supporting the revolution. He might have added a few thousand, give or take, it's hard to tell. Alrighty, hopping over to slide 18. So this section goes into like the writing itself and not just how he does his argument. So the article's written in a matter-of-fact tone, right? So matter-of-fact just means plain information. He's not dressing up the information in any way. He's like, this is what's happening. This is what we're doing. This is our goal. This is how we're going to get there. That's it. The example of matter-of-fact language. It's plain. He gives his opinion on the status of the army and colonies as a whole. And it's important to note that he's giving his opinion, right? He actually has quotes in there where he says, my own simple opinion is, and in my own opinion. So he does tell you these are his thoughts. and that it's not like official. So some stuff he tries to pass off as official with the numbers, like with the 60,000. But when he talks about his actual thoughts on the war, he's a little more accountable in terms of saying, this is just what I think. He recognizes how difficult the situation is in because he doesn't want the soldiers to feel like it doesn't matter, right? And he recognizes the sacrifice in revolting against the king because if they lose, everything is going to be very, very worse, like very bad for the colonists, right? This is kind of an all or nothing war almost. They're fighting for their freedom to live life the way they've been living it without Britain interfering. And that's about it for the analysis here. So this is another part. I'm going to have you take another short break. We have a focus on language thing that's happening here. And this is the last section of the tutorial. I know it's going to be rough because a lot of you struggle with some of the grammar, but we'll try to break it down as well as we can. Alrighty. So we have the focus on language. This is a list of things that you were supposed to know before you get into it. This is kind of a lot. I'm going to try to discuss the things that are harder to understand because I feel like you can look some of these up, right? Like an adjective you just use to describe a noun. So if you're describing a person, place, or thing, adjective. That person is tall. Since a person is a person and you describe them as tall, tall is an adjective, right? An adverb works the same way. There's a couple other things here. A clause is part of a sentence that has a subject and a predicate. So the subject is who or what the sentence is about. The predicate is what they're doing. Those are the base two parts of a sentence. A clause is when you have both of those together. So I'm not going to cover every single thing on this list, but I will cover the more difficult things so that you have a reference. If you still don't understand, you might want to schedule for a little help. You may want to look it up on your own and see if some of the examples you see make sense. So we have direct object. This is the person, place, or thing that is doing something in a sentence. So if you say Jill throws the ball, Jill is the direct object. Indirect object is something in the sentence that has something happening to it. So if Jill is throwing the ball, Jill is the direct object. And the indirect object is the ball. The ball is the thing that's being thrown. That's what's happening to it. So direct object, person, place, or thing doing something. Indirect object, person, place, or thing something is happening to. Now, the next difficult one, I believe, is, I guess, object of a preposition. This is actually pretty easy. It just looks complicated. So a preposition is a word that explains the position of a thing, right? So if you are on the bed, the word on is the preposition because it describes where you are. So the object of a preposition would be you in this sentence. So you are the thing that's on the bed. So the object of a preposition is the thing whose position is being described, basically. And then the two more difficult ones are the subordinate clause and the predicate nominative. Nominative, sorry. So subordinate clause, we'll try to tackle that first. The subordinate clause is just a really fancy way of saying dependent clause. So we talked about clauses earlier. A clause is a part of a sentence that has a subject and a predicate, right? A subordinate clause is a piece of a sentence that has a subject and a predicate that can't be a full sentence on its own. So if you say, for example, after I finish dinner, right? That's not a full sentence. You've started with the word after, so you're hinting that there's a whole rest of the sentence, right? But that piece of the sentence after I finish dinner, right? You still have a subject that would be I, and the predicate is what you're doing. You're finishing dinner. but it's not a full sentence. So that's a subordinate clause. It's a piece of a sentence that has a subject and a predicate, a person, place, or thing doing something and what they're doing, but it's not a full sentence on its own. You have to add information to it to make it complete. That's the simplest way to describe that. Now, the hardest thing on this list by far is a predicate nominative. So that's basically it's basically a noun that renames or recategorizes something. That's the easiest way to put it. So remember a noun, person, place, or thing that renames or recategorizes something. I'll try to give you the simplest example I can. Jack is a star, right? Jack, that's a person. We're saying Jack is a star, and star is probably like movie star, right? So we're telling you that Jack is also this other thing. The other thing that Jack is the predicate nominative. So if you're saying this one thing is also this other thing, the second category, the category you're putting it in, that's the predicate nominative. That's a very fancy word just for that. So if you say, for example, you could say something like, this tastes good. Good would be a predicate nominative. You're saying this food tastes this specific way. You're categorizing it, right? So that's the easiest way to put that. Alrighty. So this table basically gives you examples of that, of a noun clause. And they explain what it is. A noun clause is a dependent clause, right? So dependent is the same thing as a subordinate clause. So just to go back really quick, subordinate clause, that piece of a sentence that still needs more information to be a complete sentence, that's a subordinate clause, and that's also known as a dependent clause. So they're going kind of back and forth between these names to get you used to it, but it kind of makes it a little more complicated. So they give you examples of a noun clause. So noun clause is a dependent clause. So it's like a piece of a sentence that's not a whole sentence that can act as a noun. So a noun is a person, place, or thing. So it's basically when you have part of a sentence that describes a noun, but it's not a full sentence. So they give you a couple of examples here. I'll go through like the first example, right? So it says here that she was upset about losing her purse is an understatement. This part, that she was upset about losing her purse, it's giving information about this girl, this she, right? So it doesn't just say she is an understatement, right? Or that thought was an understatement because it says that she was upset. So we're talking about that and then her state. That she was upset about losing her purse, right? We're getting more information about what that is, right? So that's what makes it a noun clause, when they add more information about what the person, place, or thing actually is. Another example here, you should have given what your friend said both thought and consideration. What your friend said, that is a thing, right? That thing that your friend said, that is an actual idea, a concept, right? So they're saying you should have given that both thought and consideration. And if you had a question, well, what is that? What is that thing? It is what your friend said. So this stuff kind of takes a bit of time to sort of get used to. I would try to write down these examples to have in your notes for if you get a question about noun clauses on the test. They do give you some words here that can help you out if you think you kind of got it. These words help a lot. It says subordinating conjunctions. So these are words that connect to a noun clause. So basically, if you see these words, that, how, when, where, whether, why, it tells you that what comes after that is probably a noun clause. So this is kind of like a cheat sheet. And then pronouns are other words that might show up in a noun clause. So these are all words to look out for. So having these as a hint might actually help you answer some of the questions on the mastery test. All right, so now we're on adverbial clause. That's basically the same thing as a noun clause, but for verbs. So an adverb is a word that describes how you do something, right? Because verb is in action. I ran to the store. But how did you run? I ran quickly, right? So if you're explaining you went fast, that's an adverb because you used a word to describe how you did the action. So an adverbial clause is a piece of a sentence that's used to describe how you did something. It says here dependent clause. That's the piece of the sentence that needs more information, right? To be a complete sentence. It says that modifies a verb. So this is just the part that's an adverb. So modifies is to change a verb or an adjective, right? By telling where, why, how, when, or to what degree something is done. So if you're describing the way something was done or something about how it was done, that's an adverbial clause. So then you get these highlighted sections here where they show you where the adverbial clause is. Julia left the bicycle where she found it, right? So found is the verb here. That's the thing that she did. But we're getting information about how she found it, where she found it in this case. She left the bicycle where she found it. Found is the verb, but there's more information about finding this thing. She left it where she found it. And then they give you keywords down here. It says adverbial clauses are usually introduced by a subordinating conjunction. So this is the same thing. They talk about words that you're likely to see next to an adverbial clause. After, although, as if, that kind of thing. So they give you these in alphabetical order, but I would write these down and write down at least one example of an adverbial clause. That way, when you go to the test, you can take a look at the example sentence, have an example of what an adverbial clause is, underline that bold part, and then you can look at this table and say, oh, do any of these answers have these words in it? Because that might be the adverbial clause. And that'll probably help you out. Alrighty. That is actually it, I think. Yeah. Yeah, okay, that is the last slide for this tutorial. So let me stop sharing. Alrighty, so I know that that was a doozy. That was a lot. The reading was a lot. The timeline was a lot. And also the focus on language was a lot. If you need any help, please, 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 please don't hesitate to ask a curriculum specialist for help. We can go over it with you. We can try to give you more examples. We can sit with you while you take the test and try to give you reminders about things. So don't hesitate to reach out. If you don't have any of our links already, please, please, please ask your advocate to put you in contact with one of our curriculum specialists. Alrighty. That's pretty much it for this lesson. And because it was so long, I don't want to linger any longer. So my name is Miss Amber. Thanks for joining me for this video today, and good luck with the rest of your English class.